The Confederation and the Constitution, Chapter 9. The American Revolution was a time period where America didn't experience an outright revolution, but rather it experienced an evolution that gave way change. Some changes that did occur were social customs, political institutions, and ideas about society, government, and even gender roles. Pursuit of equality. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed equality. An example is ordinary men and women can be addressed as Mr. and Mrs. when these titles once were reserved for the wealthy. Another example of many other examples is employers were now referred to as boss, not masters. Another example would be the separation of church and state. The fight for equality unleashed by the war challenged the institution of slavery. The Continental Congress in 1774 called for the abolition of slave trade, but this didn't succeed. No state south of Pennsylvania abolished slavery. Laws discriminated harshly against free African Americans and slaves. The freedom for these African Americans didn't go further because a fight over slavery would have broken the national unity that was needed. As James Madison had wrote, "Great as the evil of slavery is, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse." During this time, women also struggled for the equality they wanted, but they were luckier and got more rights than African Americans did at the time, such as women were able to vote part of New Jersey's new Constitution in 1776. But women didn't go untouched by revolutionary ideals. The idea of Republican motherhood relied on women to educate their families, to cultivate virtues by the Republic. The Republic relying on women to educate their husbands, daughters, and sons, it offered them responsibility for the survival of the nation, so it gave them more opportunities and rights. Constitution making in the states. In 1776, Continental Congress called upon the colonies to draft new constitutions. Continental Congress were really asking the colonies to summon themselves into being new states. The sovereignty of these new states would give them the power or authority of the people. The constitutions or documents they drafted were contracts that defined the powers of government. Furthermore, the state constitutions intended to represent fundamental laws. It also introduced the Bills of Rights. Massachusetts had called for a special convention to draft its constitution, and then submitted the final draft directly to the people for ratification. Once this was adopted in 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution could only be changed by another specially called Constitutional Convention. This procedure later led to the drafting and ratification of the federal constitution. Americans had created something different. The documents drafted were contracts that defined the powers of government. They drew their authority from people, not from the royal see of distant kings. The state constitutions were intended to represent a fundamental law superior to the transient whims of ordinary legislation. Most of these documents included Bills of Rights, specially guaranteeing long-prized liberties against their later legislative encroachment. A shaky start toward union. After the Americans won the Revolution, they were left with the responsibility of creating a new central government. It can be very difficult to set up a new type of government, although hopeful signs could be discerned. The 13 sovereign states were alike in government structure and functioned under the similar constitutions. Americans enjoyed a rich political inheritance, derived partly from Britain and partly from their own homegrown devices of self-government. Finally, they were blessed with political leaders of a high order in men like George Washington, James Madison, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. Creating a confederation. Before America had declared independence in 1776, Congress had appointed a committee to draft a written constitution for the new nation. The final product was the Articles of Confederation. The articles hadn't been ratified by all 13 states until 1781. 6 of the states were happy because they hadn't had any holding beyond the Allegheny Mountains, but notably New York and Virginia had acreage. The 6 states argued that the more fortunate states shouldn't have this acreage. Unanimous approval of the Articles of Confederation by the 13 states was required, so Maryland had held out until March 1st, 1781. Maryland had given in once New York surrendered its western claims, and so did Virginia. This had almost caused 7 of the colonies from signing the Articles of Confederation. Congress pledged to dispose of the vast areas from common benefit. This had given equality between the states. Articles of Confederation in America's first Constitution. The Articles set up a government that could consist of a one-house body delegates. Every state had one vote. Every state could only have a single vote, which, acting collectively, could make decisions that affected all the states. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which guaranteed no decisions would ever be made. The Congress were also very limited on the decisions they could make. This led to one of the biggest crises facing the nation, the Northwest Ordinance. The government made a treaty land. The Northwest Ordinance in 1787 outlawed slavery in all 5 of the states that they had received from the Native Americans. The Articles were still a mess because they racked up lots of debt from the war. The government used tariffs as their main way for paying off this debt, but they couldn't impose the tariffs, so the states had to do it individually. This made international trade a nightmare because Britain refused to trade with America after they had lost the war. This problem got so bad in 1786 in Massachusetts that the farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent the government from closing their farms that were in debt. This was known as Shays' Rebellion. This crisis showed that the government had to do something. This led to the making of the Constitution and the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise. This convention was to amend the Articles of Confederation and fix the crisis our nation was facing. The biggest issue they were facing was representation, which was large states versus smaller states, and how to represent them. They had come up with 2 different plans, which were the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan was the large state plan. Its essence was that representation in both houses, bicameral Congress, should be based on population, which would give bigger states an advantage. The New Jersey Plan was the smaller states plan. It wanted equal representation in unicameral Congress by state, regardless population and state size, as it existed under the Articles of Confederation. Both of these had failed and left the convention at square one. This was until the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise had given the states equal representation. This meant the large states were represented by the House of Representatives, and the smaller states were by equal representation in the Senate. No matter how poor or small, it would have 2 senators. The big states obviously yielded more. As a sop to them, the delegates agreed that every tax bill or revenue measure must be originate in the House, where population counted more heavily. The final Constitution was short, but not least because it grew out of the Anglo-American common law legal tradition, which made it unnecessary to be specific about every conceivable detail. It mostly provided a flexible guide to broad rules of procedures rather than a fixed set of details. The original Constitution contained just 7 articles and ran to about 10 pages printed. In conclusion, the social and political changes during that time had a big impact on our country. The Declaration of Independence gave an inequality that was needed, and the Constitution set solid laws. Although there was a lot of setbacks and difficulties in creating our Constitution and Confederation, we wouldn't be here where we are today without it.